After all, shadow soldiers and even shadow snow bears were everywhere. They didn't understand what was going on. This elf thought it was a cheap trick, but after his words I began to act, and my shadow soldiers began to attack them. And so the battle began in a fierce battle, with the White Walkers on one side and my shadow soldiers on the other. The other hunters began to retreat, as they were undecided about a battle that was beyond their strength. I watched this battle and realized that he didn't seem to be bluffing when he called it a cheap trick. Despite the advantage in numbers, my army wouldn't be able to hold out much longer. They may be immortal, but I can't keep up their numbers for long. From the moment I pumped them, they should have overpowered the elves, but the problem was the boss. That problem was enough to know how strong he was. And even if I teamed up with Igris, it still wouldn't be easy. An ordinary soldier won't do here, and I need a stronger shadow. The boss elf began to say that his name was Barak, and asked what my name was. I answered that my name was soon Jin Woo. I stepped on the captain's sword and thus started running towards the boss to attack him. This caused his sword to swing right back at the captain's sword. I jumped up and wanted to strike this boss elf, but he successfully dodged my attack. I kept attacking him, and my blade moved from one hand to the other, but this elf still blocked all my attacks, and in the end, he kicked me with his foot, sending me flying to the side. I immediately got to my feet and heard him say that he hadn't been this excited in a long time. At that moment my attention was diverted by a mage, who used his magical power to create an explosion that occurred behind the elf. Thanks to the mage I had some time, and now I had to make my plan a reality. At this time, the captain was beginning to come to his senses and get to his feet. He was pondering exactly what had happened. Then he heard my voice when I hit him, and it made him angry. He took his sword and said he was going to kill me. After the explosion, I looked at the fire and knew that it wouldn't just go out. I ordered this alpha to stop wasting my time and come out to me with a horrible grin. He started to run at me and tell me that was all my soldiers could do. But I stood my ground, for I had a plan. And at that moment the captain ran at me, and behind me he ran and tried to kill me. This boss elf realized that he didn't seem to be the only one who wanted my head. But I knew this could happen, and at that very moment I called for my commander-in-chief, who was behind me, and he showed up just in time. For the captain was already ready to kill me. Igris blocked his blow and ended up killing the captain. I stood all in the shadows and knew this would happen. The captain was bleeding all over, the veteran was very badly wounded, and at the same moment the captain realized that I had planned everything beforehand. For I had planned his destruction from the beginning, and eventually the captain began to lose his strength, and then died. The elf boss wondered what would happen, for he could see that nothing had changed. But at that moment I ordered the captain, who was dead, to rise up behind me. Finally, I was able to get rid of the shadow, and I have a new, very strong partner. He is much bigger than before, and he is much stronger now. Now I have to choose a name for him. After much deliberation I decided to call him Iron, the new knight in my ranks. Then he started telling me to stop, because I don't think this guy could stop him on his own. But I didn't think so. I ordered Iron Man to use his shouting skill. At this point, the dungeon boss began to flinch. The elf started screaming that another strange guy had appeared and that he was going to start with him. The boss began to attack Iron, but he managed to block his attacks with his large and strong shield. And when Aaron struck, the boss was able to dodge it. At this speed he could not hit him, because Iron was big, but very slow. However, the boss didn't know that there were 3 of us here, and that the 3 of us could definitely take him down. My group was watching everything that was going on. They were surprised and didn't understand how all the hunters were fighting. After all, they had never seen a real fight between monsters before, never heard or seen anything like it. It seemed to them that they were seeing a dream. Igris lunged at him with his sword. But at that moment I was behind the chieftain and was able to wound him. So I applied the effects of paralysis and bleeding. Even if he could have dodged a fatal blow in that situation, he wouldn't have been able to handle the 3 of us. After a few wounds, the dungeon boss calmed down a bit and began to tell us in a calm tone that we were a bunch of scumbags. At this point my opponent's resistance was too high, and the effect of my attack was deflected. I knew he was in no position to say such things, so I asked him if I could examine his condition. When he turned around, I saw that all of his soldiers had been destroyed by my shadow monsters. I didn't think that was all his soldiers were capable of. The dungeon leader was angry that I had destroyed all of his soldiers, and immediately rushed into battle because he knew that if he could destroy me, he would get rid of all of my shadow soldiers. However, as soon as I saw him running toward me, I threw my blade at him. But the chief was puzzled by this action and started laughing, saying that I was throwing my weapon like an idiot. But he didn't know that I had a skill that allowed me to speed up a flying blade several times. And once the dagger accelerated, I was able to penetrate his defenses. At that moment Iron was able to sneak up and grab me. And while the boss had nowhere to run, my mages behind me began casting a fire spell. When the Big Bang exploded, only a shadow was left where Iron was standing and holding the boss. The boss came out of that shadow and started screaming that we were all children and that he was going to kill us all. The dungeon boss was terribly angry and was already ready to attack us. But at some point a wound appeared on his side, and thanks to my invisibility I was right next to him. I gave him a crushing blow with my blade, which he definitely didn't expect, and that was the end of it. But the boss couldn't just give up. He rushed toward me, holding my hand. Iron was at his back again and dealt him a crushing blow, which happened exactly as I had predicted. It was over, and the boss was destroyed. At last we can breathe. I finally managed to defeat the dungeon boss and my level went up. I was happy that it was finally over. But suddenly Iron began to mercilessly finish off his opponent, as if he had lost his mind. Although he had turned into a shadow, he remained the same thug as before. As soon as I asked him to stop and calm down, I stepped back and wondered what would happen next. As soon as I stepped back from the errand, he met Igris's gaze, but Igris looked at him strangely. Then he lowered his head and walked away. But when Irons turned around, there were two more shadows behind him. He raised his hands and shouted with them, "Yo!" At this point I asked my group to turn around and pack up, but they were surprised. After all, they didn't think we were going to start walking home now. At that moment a gate appeared next to us. I showed them all that it was a portal to the outside. They were very excited to finally be able to go home. But I still had things to do. It was my shadow's turn. It was already 3 a.m. on the other side of the brother, and those guys who were standing there realized that it had been a week behind the gate. The head subordinate said that they could stay here, and that the head should go home first. But the head replied that the guild members were confined inside, and how could he go home to rest? We must at least wait until morning and then think. But at the same moment the red gate began to change its color. As soon as the gate opened, the dungeon was cleared and people began to come out of there. One of the guild guys began to rejoice that Kim had made it. As the hunters began to come out, the guys who had been standing the whole time began to shout that they had survived. After them, the last one who was there came out, that was me. One of the head's subordinates rejoiced, for he thought so. And as soon as the gate disappeared, the head began to ask what happened there and where Kim was, because it can't be that everyone who survived. But the girl who was inside the dungeon answered that yes, that was it. The head was shocked that everyone who came back was only unranked hunters. He was wondering what had happened inside, but at this point I started walking past the chapter and told my sister that I would take her home. But suddenly the head of the White Tiger Guild stopped me and said we needed to have a little talk. However, I pushed his hand away and said I was very tired. If he wants to know something, let him ask his guild guys. But suddenly he grabbed me by my clothes and said that it was not a request, for he was the head of the White Tiger Guild, and it was an order or perhaps a threat. They lost 9 guild members in this raid. As head of the guild, he has to ask me some questions. I wasn't interested, but I asked him, so what? I mean, I saved the other 3. And if he really was the head, shouldn't he have thanked me in the first place? After all, it wasn't easy. At this point, the head agreed and said I was right. He apologized to me, and I was able to continue on my way. Soon I got in my car to go home. The girl who was sitting there drinking hot tea was with me inside the dungeon, and the head started asking her who the guy was and why he was so annoyed. After that she started to answer that she didn't know, but after defeating the boss he shouted something out 3 times in front of his corpse, and then we just left. The head's subordinates started telling him not to get mad at that guy because he's not a bad person and maybe he's just tired. But the head replied that that wasn't the problem, and why he still hadn't recruited him, because he was so confident against me. I should prepare to lose an arm if I fight him. After these reflections, the chief ordered his subordinate to deal with it immediately and recruit that fellow. Although the guy said he would do his best, the head replied that it wasn't enough and promised his full support. because he had to get him into their guild at all costs. When the conversation was over, the head left. And I was driving home in the car with my sister's girlfriend, and I began to speculate that this situation was probably due to our difference in strength. I had failed 3 times to retrieve the dungeon boss shadow, and that was a big loss for me. Of course, the method I was able to get the dagger from the barrack. This dagger belonged to the great warrior, and the light enchantment makes the wearer more agile. I was lucky to get something. As we drove up to the house, she told the girl one last time that she had done well, and wished me well on my way home. The last thing I heard was that she began to thank me for today, and I would see her later. I didn't know what she meant when she said later. And as soon as she ran back to her house, I looked at my watch and realized that not even 24 hours had passed, and I had been there for a whole week, and today was not going to pass right with Jin Woo the next morning. I saw the shiny outfit in front of me again. I asked Jin Woo if that was why he had called a cab, because I was planning to pick him up. Jin Woo began to tell me that his mentor was helping him, so he could get there on foot. We started to drive out and he told me that we had to pick up someone else on the way. I started calling Sun and told her to get out and we'd give her a ride. Jin Woo didn't fully understand who I was calling, and as soon as I said her name, he realized who it was and started thinking about the fact that he knew her number and how close her relationship with her mentor was. He wondered how close the relationship was between Sun and her mentor. And as soon as we got there, Jin Woo turned to me and started asking if he should start calling this girl his sister-in-law from now on. But I didn't expect such a question and told him she was just a friend of my sister's. And as soon as she got out and walked to the car, she sat down next to me, and I started asking her if she had managed to get any sleep at all. But she said she couldn't even get a nap, so I asked her to rest in the car for a while we got to the place. At this time, Jin Woo looked at me with a horrified look on his face and heard me talking about how she couldn't sleep, that she was tired, and that she came home at 4 o'clock in the morning. He began to think about what he was really saying, that she was just his sister's friend. At this point I heard Jin Woo start to tell me that she was underage, and I answered him by asking, and what's the big deal? After that, Jin realized that I was not normal, and he should not judge a mentor with his mediocre standards. Soon we were able to get to the place where we began to pass through the dungeon. The monsters that met on our way were falling to pieces. It was all thanks to my shadow soldiers. Jin couldn't believe his eyes as he watched my soldiers destroy everything in their path. He didn't understand who these guys were. I realized that Jin was seeing them for the first time, and I told him it was my ability. He couldn't believe his eyes and ears. After all, I could summon these guys with my ability. But it was pretty hard for me to explain it to him, even though it's convenient, and they hunt for me and do all sorts of little things. But Jin got a little frustrated and asked me if he could at least do crystal collecting. But I didn't understand why. And he replied that he felt useless, and that was a shame. After that I smiled and realized that he was really entertaining. I watched my Jin soldiers collect magic crystals, and I realized that despite this, the Jin raids would be over tomorrow. The next day we completed all the promised 19 raids. However, we are now shown that something terrible is happening on the east coast of the United States in the Yarang dungeon, for horrible screams are coming from there. Inside the dungeon, one of the hunters could not believe his eyes. For he had seen the assault squad destroyed, and he could not believe it. The man he saw turned out to be a figurative monster. They found no monster in this dungeon, and the hunter thought there was something wrong here. No one could have imagined that such a monster would appear in the boss's room. The magic that emanated from this guy was comparable to mine in a dungeon, rank and file, and it was impossible to believe. The hunter wondered only one thing, just how strong was this guy? But suddenly the man who had been in the dungeon began to approach the hunter. He took hold of his head and started telling the hunter not to worry, because he hadn't killed all those guys, they were just unconscious. And he decided to ask why they attacked him, since he was just a man, not a monster. But suddenly the man realized that the hunter didn't understand him, because he found himself in England, and they didn't know Japanese. At the end, the man held up his thumb and pointed it in my direction, saying that his name was Kurt and that he wanted to go home. However, at this time I was sitting with Jin Woo in a cafe, and he started to tell me that the raid was over. He apologized to me and offered to take me to a more luxurious place for our last time. However, I was more concerned that this was not the place for a young man from a noble family. We started drinking alcohol, but my body coped with the harmful substance and detoxed quickly. I asked Jin what he was going to do after the raids were over, and he said he was going to get his guild head license after a simple test exam given by the association. Then, with the license in hand, he was going to talk to his father, and his promise of a mentor would be fulfilled. I understood that getting a $30 million building was a nice bonus, but my real goal was to upgrade, and since I had reached my goal, there was no point in lingering here. Jenny asked me, what will I do next? But I looked at my hand, which held the dungeon key. It opened the gate of the castle, and the key was obtained by killing the gatekeeper. I told him that I would be unavailable for a while, as there was something he had to do. Jin started telling me that if he was going to be a burden to me, I should let him know, because he didn't want to bother me anymore. And here again, Jin misunderstood me. But lastly, I decided to ask Jin exactly what he wanted to say. What am I to him? He started to tell me that he has an older brother who is 10 years older than him. He doesn't like his brother very much, and we rarely spend time together. Unlike his brother, the mentor who saved his life and helps with his problems is more like a brother to me than a real brother. I answered him. If that's the way he thinks of me, then I will consider him my little brother. After these words, he cried and started screaming, asking if he could hug me. I told him he was just drunk. But Jin started sobbing, and I looked at him, not understanding what was wrong with him. Suddenly I heard a voice coming from the TV, and the news was saying that there had been a major incident during the training of the new recruits. All the high-ranking hunters died, and only the low-ranking ones managed to survive. There are also rumors from the survivors that someone helped them. They asked what the chapter thought about it, and the White Tiger head began to say that the investigation by the association had been completed and it was true there had been an accident, but there had been no interference from the other side. As soon as I heard the word intervention, I didn't realize if it was me they were talking about there. And that was the end of the questions. After the reporter's question, the White Tiger head drove in his car. He was finally able to exhale, because those reporters were terrible, and they were really good at sniffing out details. And just as the head of the White Tiger was able to drive to his office, he got an incoming call from a Minbian hunter. And when the secretary put the call through, the head began to be asked why he had turned off his phone. But he was going to hide from the reporters until they calmed down. The head of the White Tiger sat in his chair and was upset about the whole situation. But that guy started telling him not to worry so much about it, because things would calm down soon, and there was news on an important case. The guy who called began to tell the chapter that Japan had secretly contacted the Korean Hunters Association about a week ago, and after checking personally, he was convinced that it was more serious than he thought. Soon it would spread throughout Korea. Japan allowed the Korean Hunters Association. The head was perplexed. Those were the words. But as soon as the head heard the words from the guy who said that Japan was requesting a consultant from hunters who had experience in the Jeju Island raid, the White Tiger head asked him to elaborate. And the guy started saying that the S-Rang gate had opened on Jeju Island 4 years ago. After the failure of 3 operations, the government abandoned the idea of freeing the island, and even after 4 years it is still occupied by ants. The head of the White Tiger began to remember the place where he and Hen almost died. It was the nightmare he didn't want to forget. That guy started to speculate that the ants had undergone mutations, but the head said it didn't matter, because they weren't stuck on that island and nothing would happen even if we left it alone. But that guy started saying that they could leave the island just by flying across the ocean, because an ant with wings had been discovered on the Japanese coast. And these ants are evolving at a terrifying rate. The next day I packed my things, and my sister started telling me that I had been leaving home a lot lately. Suddenly I decided to go on a trip, but I told her I was going away for a week. My sister started asking me who I was going on the trip with. My brother found someone special, but I lied to her and told her I was going with a friend. In fact, I was alone. A little later I found myself outside one of the buildings, which suddenly burst into a bright red flame. I stood outside this building and started thinking about how I had once defeated a Cerberus at a level of at least 20 or higher, and now my level was 3 times higher. It shouldn't be as hard for me as it was last time. That key I had in my hands, I must use now to enter this gate and become much stronger than before. And as soon as the gate was open and I could go inside, and at the same moment I got the assignment. But as soon as I went in, I didn't understand what it was, because there weren't even ghosts, monsters, but just a corridor that led me to another entrance. I started to read the tasks that were given to me, and it said that I had to collect the devil's soul, because the devil tore his soul and created demons for special rewards. I must track down the demons and collect their souls, and the conditions for completing the task were to collect 10,000 soul shards. I realized it had been a while since I had been on a mission, and were the rewards for this challenge too generous? After all, I could get extra ability points and choose one item in the store, and there were items in the store worth more than 10 billion, and I could get them just by completing the challenge. With such a high reward, the difficulty level of the quest should be much higher. I started to open the second door and realized that there were no monsters in sight at all. But what I saw next made me not believe my eyes. It was a field dungeon. I didn't expect a dungeon to be a field-type dungeon. And really, did this dungeon recreate all of Seoul after the war? I just needed to collect 10,000 soul shards, which means there must be at least 10,000 demons in the demon castle. I can get one soul from one demon, but there are demons on the upper floors that hold multiple souls. I lied to my sister that I was going on a trip, so I have to do everything in a week. And finally the battle began, and I started destroying all the demons that were in my way. And now I realize that it's easier for me to destroy them. I had 60,000 experience left before the next level, and I realized that even this time the experience indicator came up, and it was handy. It was my time to fight, but at that time Jin met his father at a mansion, and his father began to ask him if he really wanted to run the Eugene Guild. But Jin was very sure of himself and said that's why he came to see his father. His father began to look at the guild master's license and his entire service list. At this time he reflected on the difficult choice before him between himself and his brother. He understood that an invitation to be a guild master was a big risk, but his father suddenly got up and interrupted Jin, saying that he wanted to introduce him to someone. And at that moment a hunter, Myung Wang, came through the door. Father began to say that he was one of the survivors of the recent incident with the Red Gate and the White Tiger Guild. The father asked that guy to sit down and tell his son who was with him that day. That guy began to say that it was a young girl hunter, probably a high school girl, and Mr. Jin Woo, who was a mentor. There may have been a girl named Miss Han with them. He went on to say that thanks to Mr. Jin Woo, they were able to survive the Red Gate. At first they thought it was ridiculous that two hunters had joined their mid to high-ranking training. Jin didn't even listen to the other guy, and we figured it out anyway. After all, he's the one who knows the most about the mentor's abilities, and now he's not the only one who knows the mentor's secret. Now there's a negotiation going on with the father. But that guy kept saying don't we know how to contact Jin Woo, because he tried to find out from the White Tiger Guild, but it was hard to get anything from them. And then he got a call from the principal. And at this point my father began to say that it seemed that Hunter Myung Wang had told us enough, and we should already know that he was looking for information about qualified hunters and had already tried to investigate the incidents with the Red Gate. And there was a suspicion that no helper was involved there, however. His father didn't expect to find his name on the list of people on our raid with Jin Ho, and his father began to tell Jin that it wasn't a good time to negotiate and that this guy, Jin Woo, had done his son an invaluable service in getting his license. At this point, Jin began to think that there was no difference between his brother and him. After all, they both received outside help, and his father had no reason to choose him. After this reflection, Jin asked his father if he could trust the guild to him, at which point his father agreed and said he would trust Eugene to run the guild. After all, it's exactly as he said, inviting an outsider to the role of guild master is a very big risk. If there is a need to take a risk when he has him, what fool wouldn't withhold something during negotiations? That's why he agreed. Didn't need an assistant, though. His father went on to say that this man was a Jin Woo hunter, and could his son make him join the Eugene Guild. And so the chance to act came, and Jin told his father that he would do his best, because the son of a tiger is also a tiger, and there are two S-ranked hunters that he had looked out for the Eugene Guild. There's Chai of the Emin Bengu Guild of Hunters, who recently retired, and one of them is confined to the position of deputy to a fellow known as an absolute weapon. In comparison, there are many advantages to becoming a guild master Eugene with financial support. He used this as one of the conditions, and even though Minbian has a healthy body and can still be active as a hunter, he offered to resign after 3 failed raids on Shinju Island. But the bodies of ants have been discovered in Japan, and if a 4th raid on Shinju Island is formed, he should be able to win his favor. And Jen wondered if he could win their favor first. This time I defeated the horrible monsters that came my way. I realized that there was still a long way to go to become stronger than I had been before. After all, I could defeat an inferior demon now, but I was sure that I could also defeat the monsters I had once met in the dungeon. Initially, the difficulty of the demonic castle was not that high, and it looks like this area has already been completely cleared. The monsters here were at most rank D. Despite this, I got quite a few experience points. Before, I had to clear 9 ranked dungeons to level up. But here I can level up in 4 hours, and as I level up the amount of experience points to the next level also increases. In other words, leveling up gets harder over time. And I felt it when I met the head of the White Tiger and my current rank barely reached S. To get stronger, I have to keep evolving at the same pace. I can probably get the item. It was a passageway to the second floor of the demonic castle, and it could only be used in the moving magic circle on the first floor. I looked up the mountain and saw that the magical moving circle between floors must be in the Summon Tower area. At this point I summoned my soldier, and a huge ice bear leader appeared in front of me. I thought he looked just like a heavy tank. I climbed on top of him, and we started climbing up, but suddenly I saw 3 horrible, big monsters in front of me, and they started to get annoying. After all, they appeared very often. But my bear decided to take matters into his own hands. He began to run with all his speed, and with full determination he crashed into them. I realized that this guy was just crazy, and from that moment on he would run like a tank. As soon as the monsters had dispersed, I ordered him to run to the magic circle. At this time, however, the American Hunters Association in Washington began to talk about what the deputy director of the American Dungeon Hunters Association was claiming as if he were a hunter from South Korea. They wondered how a hunter from South Korea came out of a dungeon on the other side of the earth. After all, he said, he was stuck in the dungeon when the gate closed 10 years ago. And when he opened his eyes, he woke up already in America. And it was an unusual occurrence. And not only was the famous A-rank hunter out, but the rank, the man, and the squad formed of A-rank hunters was helpless against him. And one of the other guys asked what the full content of the interrogation was and why he hadn't gathered more information. But the other guys suspected that he might be a monster with human memories, and without the help of an S-rank hunter, all of Washington might be in danger. So they decided to ask the Scavenger Guild in Washington if the S-rank hunter knew Korean. But the Chief Scavengers Guild hunter was on his way, and he had recently finished his business in Korea and was now on his way back to America. And just as these guys had scheduled an interrogation for tomorrow afternoon, the Scavenger Guild hunter was walking through the airport and pondering that he was having a very bad day. After all, the parasite he wanted to kill with his own hands was stuck in the red gate, and it couldn't be worse. Those guys kept looking at the man and started asking others if they knew his name. But one of the guys said that the pronunciation was pretty complicated, but he was a hunter, and his name was probably Sun and Huang. At this time I was fighting in this dungeon and realized that each floor of the themed castle is a different world. You can get a pass from a random monster on each floor, and you can only get to the next floor after getting a pass. Given that the tower has about 100 floors, this place includes 100 worlds. I went through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 27th floors. Time passed, and I progressed through the floors at a frightening rate. At one point I managed to defeat a mid-level demon and gain 300 experience. A mid-level demon is, at best, equal to a higher rank. And probably the difficulty of higher or even stronger demons would increase exponentially, just like the difference in strength between A-rank and S-rank hunters. But the main problem was time. If the floors were really 100, it would be impossible to get to the top floor in a week. When I got the key to the demon castle, I was intimidated by the S rank of this dungeon, but because of the boring battles over time, my anxiety began to fade. And when I finally made it to the 50th floor, I met the ruler of the lower floors, whose name was Greedy Vulcan. He was very big and was surrounded by his army of monsters. It was a demon boss. When I saw him, I knew he was a giant and looked dangerous, and I would have to take care of him personally. And as soon as we started, my mages began to conjure a terrifying power. And as soon as the magic deployed its fiery attacks, the entire battlefield was on fire. I ordered my soldiers to take care of the rest. They just need to eliminate them while I take care of the boss. I watched my shadow soldiers fight, and I realized that although the guards consisted of higher demons, my shadow soldiers were also increasing their level. They were getting stronger according to my intelligence, and the number of shadows I could retain was also increasing. After I greatly increased my intelligence, I had enough mana to restore them. However, when I saw the guy sitting on the throne, he didn't even move. I figured I'd just go ahead and finish him off, because it was easier than I thought. But in an instant, the lord of the land disappeared from my sight. I didn't know where he'd gone, and as soon as I looked up, I saw that he was already in the air, and I didn't understand what the movement was. He appeared to be too fast, and in an instant he began to crush my shadow soldiers. He could not destroy iron, and the next one he would defeat was Igris. I couldn't believe my eyes that he was able to take out several of my commander-in-chief's mothers with just one blow. I didn't want to just stand there and watch. I was already up in the air, swung and decided that this monster should pay for attacking my soldiers. I struck his face with all my might. After I hit him, he flew several hundred meters away. I lost my temper and punched him, but I wondered why he flew so far away. Suddenly I looked at my stats and realized that I had stupidly put all my points into power. I looked at him and saw that he was in the wall, which he flew into after I hit him. And at that moment the ruler of the lower floors, the greedy volcanoes, began to use his anger skill, and from that moment on he would be in a constant state of rage, and his characteristics had increased by 50%. I realized that this was the same new one Cerberus was using. It flew straight at me, and I realized that it got faster, and I didn't have time to dodge, and it would be a direct hit. I realized I could call my shadow soldier Iron for help. And as soon as Iron heard my cry, he threw his big shield in my direction with all his might. I didn't think it would have time to reach me, but the shield flew with such speed that it flew literally in a second through the entire battle that was in its path. Eventually I was able to catch his shield and use it. And as soon as the volcano's blow reached me, I was able to react and use that shield to block his blow with the big club. However, the explosion after the blow was overwhelming, and all the rocks began to crumble beneath my feet. He kept hitting me with his big club. I knew that I could withstand these blows because of my strength, but I had to find a moment to counterattack. During the next attack, when he made a sweeping move, I would counterattack and try to take him down. As I flew toward him, I realized that he, too, was waiting for this chance. As he flew, he also swung at me, and while I was in the air, I realized that I couldn't dodge. And if only I could dislodge my body, but suddenly it came to me that I could use my ruler's touch skills. And even if I couldn't push it away, I could use the recoil to push myself back and still. I got it, but it was too close. If it had hit, there wouldn't have been a wet spot left of me. I looked at him and realized that the only place I could hurt him with the dagger was his head, but it would be too dangerous to aim for his head while continuing to read his movements. I need to slow down his grotesque movement first. I need to create an insurmountable situation, and as soon as the building started collapsing nearby, I knew this was my chance. And in that moment, I completely lost my cool and started just following me. He kept running, and as soon as the building that was falling was next to me, I knew this was my chance. I used my sprinting skill and climbed up the building above me. And even though he noticed, it was too late. It would be hard for him to stop suddenly at that speed, and at that moment I jumped away from the building and started flying in his direction. But he started smiling strangely, as if he knew what was coming next, as if he could see the future. I was so fast that he didn't even realize how I was able to penetrate his thick armor. From the tremendous pain he was in, he started screaming so loudly that his screams echoed all around him. At this time in my house, my grandmother began telling the White Tiger Association guys that the young man was from apartment 902. She wasn't sure, because she hadn't seen him in a long time, but those guys were wondering where the hunter Sung Jin Woo had gone. But the girl began to say that her sister told her that he and his friends had gone on a week-long trip. She contacted Hansen, who was with Jin Woo that day. She reached out to her because she was close to Jin Woo's younger sister, and they had traveled all the way to his house. But all was in vain, for there was no trace of the year of departure from the country and no record of any withdrawal or credit card use. The girl was surprised that they could check such things, but the guy replied that it was his job to keep track of the hunters. If the tracker records with the Hunters Association were to be believed, he was last seen somewhere downtown, and that was kind of weird. The girl thought he'd been kidnapped, but the guy smirked, because he knew it would take at least a Chinese special squad of high-ranking hunters to kidnap him. That guy didn't understand where I could go, but at that moment I was fighting against the terrifying monster that stood in my way. I was ready to tear him to pieces, for he was hindering my progress. Of course, in the end, after a long and grueling battle between me and this powerful boss, I still managed to destroy it. I was also very surprised, because the boss had fallen out with great loot, which I was very happy about. The water of Peace Piece was made from a cap that had been cleared of contaminated and negative energy. Wood derived from a volcano cudgel was used to create this fragment. World water has strong magical energy and is used as material to enhance magical tools. Although I don't know where to use it, I can't throw it away as I may need it in the future. The next artifact I put on allowed me to realize its Seth effect. If you try to destroy all the demons in the place, the rest of the Seth items will fall out as well. I realized this when I collected them all, and the last of them was a fantastic effect. If I had magic skills, I could have used this magical tool myself, a ball made from the blood of a high Vulcan demon. It increases the magical effect and allows me to do more damage. I wondered about a power that could increase my attack and double its effectiveness in battle, but at that moment there were monster heads near my feet, and I saw that they were Agris. He brought them to me and I asked him, can't he stop doing that? Every time he repeats it over and over and brings me these heads at my feet. What do I need them for? But as soon as I turned my head, I saw Iron bring me the boss's head. I didn't understand why he was repeating after the commander-in-chief. He was pretty stupid, not even to mention the fact that I killed him. But he helped me a lot today. He lent me his shield when danger was coming at me. Suddenly I realized that I could make contact with my shadow soldiers, so I called the shadow one to me. After all, he was standing there anyway, suffering from inactivity. As soon as he approached, I handed him that magic orb. I ordered him to aim and strike with all his might at the building I was pointing my finger at. He began to conjure his fireball, but I didn't expect this one to be many times larger than his previous orbs. It was incredible, such power, and just as he began his attack, the building began to burn unreal. At that moment, I picked up that orb and looked at it, realizing that it was an incredible power. There was also no clause in its description about not being able to pass it on to someone else. I wondered about the incredible power of truth. Who would have thought I could find such a thing? If the hunter magicians found out about it, they'd just go crazy. At the same time, in the United States, a hunter was telling a guy who got out of a dungeon that he had just come back to Washington, D.C., and such an interesting case had arisen. It was amazing. A monster showed up who could talk like a human being, and also, a smoker. But that guy started to reply that he just had to listen, because he said he wasn't a monster. If he doubts it, have him do a DNA test or something to prove that if anything comes out twisted, it stands to reason that the monster is impersonating a person. The guy they thought was a monster was staring at the hunter and didn't understand why they were doing all this. After all, he just wanted to go home. But the hunter began to say that he had better start cooperating with them, because his word would determine whether he was a man or a monster. The man agreed, and the hunter immediately began asking questions, whether he had died in the dungeon and how he had survived for 10 years in that dungeon. Could he have become undead? But to all these questions the man answered that he was not. The hunter began to say that if the man died in the dungeon, he could come back as he did. But the man replied that this was impossible, for one who had died could not go back, even if he was in the dungeon. This man also decided to ask a question, even though the hunter said he was only here to ask questions. But this man didn't care and started talking about gates and monsters. How much does humanity know about this? The hunter didn't know what he meant, but the deputy director, who was standing near the window watching the conversation, was curious. What does he know about the other side? And the man went on to say that the dungeon, the gates, and the monsters were all just a prologue to the real war. After all, the greatest catastrophe was awakened not long ago. The reluctant man began to ask, what was the purpose of his coming? And the fellow replied that to warn of disaster. The hunter went on to ask, what is the greatest catastrophe he speaks of? But the answer he heard was that he could not tell. It was incomprehensible to the hunter, for the man had returned to warn of the disaster. But he could not make it clear what kind of disaster it was, and whether people would not be better off working, the hunter asked. But the fellow replied that the numbers were nothing against his power, and even if the people united, they would simply be used, and they should know it, for they themselves were quite strong. But the hunter didn't like it, and he didn't understand how he dared to look down on him. And he began to say that therefore only he could stop it and there was no point in continuing the conversation any longer. Hunter began to look at the report that the Hunters Guild had put together. He looked at the pictures and realized that if he cut his hair he would match his picture, but he hadn't aged much like someone who had been in a dungeon for 10 years. Hunter wondered if his resume was superbly done, and he made a lot of money for his time. With the current lesser grading system and his level, he could live without worrying about anything, for he had to adapt to the new era. And just as the hunter continued to read the report, he saw that he had 2 children. At the same moment, the hunter sank into shock when he saw that his son was the same boy. And after that, the hunter asked this guy if he and I remembered his daughter. And he answered that her name was Asya and her son was son Jin Woo. And the man saw that after what was said, the hunter's bloodlust was awakened in him, and he began to hear what the hunter was saying. He said he was the only one asking questions here. But at the same moment the man also prepared himself, and there was a strong aura coming from him. He began to say that he needed an answer, and if he did not answer, force would be used. However, the hunter thought this was too presumptuous, for he was given a second chance at revenge. After he pressed the red button, he said, "You probably turned out to be a monster that I have to destroy." Hunter began to say, the monster could attack at any moment, and we must evacuate South Korea quickly. Furthermore, I am well aware of my son's current condition, for he is dead. That man could not believe the words spoken by the hunter. And as soon as he looked up, he saw that the hunter was smiling furiously and began to say that he would send him to his son. But at that moment I was on one of the floors, and as soon as I got up there, I realized that this was the floor of the dead. All of them, by someone else's order, were following directly at me, fierce zombies and terrifying skeletons who were coming and wanted to finish me off. There were so many of them that I couldn't see where they ended. For they all joined together in a bunch and were just coming at me, and there was some skeleton at the head. This skeleton seemed to be subduing all the monsters that were on this floor and controlling them. I realized that I had to kill him, and then all those monsters would fall with him. I didn't want to get my hands dirty, so I summoned Aaron and Igris, and ordered them to clear a path for me. They appeared immediately, and began to carry out my orders. Without wasting a second, they rushed forward to eliminate anyone who got in their way. As we approached them, the battle began. After my commanders-in-chief, the rest of the shadow soldiers and the bears ran. They fought very clearly. My shadow soldiers outnumbered all the other monsters that were on this floor, and that made me too happy. After all, I looked at that mage and knew that he was surprised at how strong my guys were. I was already standing close to him, and he noticed me. I asked Mage if he was expecting this. Wouldn't we be stronger? It would only be a couple of minutes before we could clear this floor and move on. That skeleton looked at me with some strange expression, and I wondered at that moment, can an undead creature feel fear? But it didn't matter anymore, because I had already begun to act and disembowel it. I, with my sprint skill, got close to him and was able to straighten him out. I thought he would be stronger, but it turned out that he was just an ordinary mage who got in my way. At the same moment, the notification system showed me that I was able to defeat Mita's soul guide. After that I received my rewards, including the spring water of the forest. Because I defeated this boss, I was able to go up 2 levels. However, this guy's magic was pretty strong, and he was able to control 100 more challenges than I did. After the battle I planned to turn him into my soldier. When I got him, his mom was contaminated and for some reason it was impossible to extract the shadow. Shadow extraction does not work on demons. As expected, a piece of that Seth I'm trying to collect fell off one boss. This time I got the Marhan demon necklace. As soon as I put it on, my agility increased by 20 points and my intelligence increased by 20 points. There was one last piece left, which meant that there was another boss waiting for me on the upper floors. But something was strange. After all, I had already collected all the souls I needed to collect, and the task was already complete. Yes, I had reached my limit, and I no longer had the strength to move on. I sat and began to think about what I should do next and how to proceed. But suddenly I saw a notification from the system that I could get the following rewards. The first was an item of my choice, and the second was a performance bonus. The third award, on the other hand, was a hidden award. I decided to choose the first award. I was now faced with the choice of any item from the store. I wondered, should I choose an item valued at billions of gold that would certainly have amazing abilities? However, I was planning on getting gear for my dungeon treks, and it was getting better and better every day. If I choose an item that is too expensive, I might end up selling it back to the store, but I need to choose what I really need. After much deliberation, I did make up my mind and chose the damn random box that was starting to show up in my hands. Now I was really curious as to what I could get. Really needed it. After all, I could choose between the cursed random box and the sacred random box, and when I had previously completed the hidden daily quest, I could understand that the sacred random box gives what the player wants, and the cursed random box gives what the player needs. I tried twice to complete the requirements of the daily quest, but never got any additional reward. I got the key to this demonic lock from the sacred random box, and because of that I was able to level up and get rare items. And, of course, I couldn't help but wonder about the contents of that damn random box. And as soon as the lights went on, the box disappeared from my hands, and in its place was a key. I wanted to look at the name and type of key, but I realized that I had never seen an item without a description before. It became a complete mystery. What is this key for and how is it used? I decided to put it in my inventory, because someday I will find a use for it. After all, the damned random box should give me the item I need. I decided to take reward number 2, and I got a performance bonus of plus 20. After that I decided that I would put all my points into intelligence, because with intelligence I could summon even more shadows. So, I would be able to add soldiers to my army. And the last thing was the hidden reward. And I accepted it, even though I didn't have much hope for anything after the cursed incident. But suddenly there was a scroll in my hand that had the recipe for the holy water of life written on it. I could learn the method of making holy water. At this time in the United States, the building where my father and that S-ranked hunter were staying was on fire, and the firemen were trying their best to put out the fire, which was getting bigger and bigger. And something told me. A hunter who was standing near this building began to tell another hunter that he had heard that when an S-rank battle takes place, the landscape changes and everything around it turns to ruins. But if the battle ended with so little damage, that means it was overwhelming, and that hunter who was in that building was hit before the damage became too serious. The next day I decided to visit my mother, who was in the hospital. Toward morning I went into the hospital and found the room where my mother lay. I watched her sleep and sat down beside her. I pondered about that scroll and the sacred water I could get in that dungeon. I had an idea, but I didn't know if I could make it happen. That object announced that it is a mysterious potion, which can cure any disease with the help of powerful magic. The effect will manifest itself only after the entire bottle has been used. I received this item for completing a quest, a potion that can cure any disease. I knew I could save my mother, so I needed to gather 3 ingredients to create the holy water of life. I got a fragment of the water of peace after defeating a volcano on the 50th floor. I also got the spring water of the deep forest after defeating the Methuselah on the 75th floor. And the last ingredient is the purified blood of the Demon King. And I haven't found the last ingredient yet, but it was pretty clear to me where it was. On the top floor of the building, probably the final boss of the demon castle on the top floor. So if I cleared the demonic castle, I could collect all the necessary ingredients for the holy water of life. While I was going through the demonic castle for a week, I picked up 16 levels. Now that I'm around rank S, I have nothing to fear. My mom had to wait a little longer. After all, I was determined that I would soon solve this puzzle. At the same time, the Korean Hunters Association was on the news that there was a huge uproar in the United States after a mysterious explosion at the American Hunters Bureau. And it was rumored that the incident was caused by an altercation between S-rank hunters. The guys who were sitting near this TV started talking amongst themselves that it was the end of the world, because hunters were the problem. But the girl who was sitting next to it started telling the assistant manager that a hunter had come, and as soon as that manager turned his head, he saw a guy standing in front of him. And he started whispering in the ear of the girl who was sitting next to him that from time to time there are hunters who can't accept reality. They think they are deceived, and it turns out this man is, too. He thought, girl, after hearing this. The assistant manager started whispering to the girls that he was going to be a nasty man. So I'll just explain to him that he has to cover the costs and escort him to the reassessment room. The girl understood what she had to do, but the assistant manager decided to pester me to see if I was the hunter who came in. But soon after the manager saw that I had come, he began abruptly calling his boss, the head of the guild, and saying that the hunter he had asked about earlier had come. The head of the guild instantly got serious and realized that the guy who had just applied had come to see him. I came to re-evaluate my rank, and the girl, smiling at me, said she would take me to another room where I could do what I had come to do. A little later I sat in the waiting room and realized that nothing had changed here since last time. Those guys who were sitting with me, some were very nervous, and others started cheering up those who were excited and saying that a few people's lives had been turned upside down. However, this doesn't happen very often. But if he passed with a given rank or higher, the scouts who were around would take notice of him, and they were all from different guilds. And as the small ones are short on people, they wait here and try to recruit hunters as soon as they are graded. These guilds are best not to join, because the small ones are often taken without stock and have a high mortality rate. I sat next to them and heard this conversation, and realized that from the small guild's point of view, there was nothing they could do about it. After all, they can't sit idly by running dungeons, but at the same time they lack the skill to defend high-ranked dungeons. So it's not surprising that accidents happen so often, but I understood that in my day they didn't. We watched as the girl kept going in and out, calling for more hunters to rush in. But the guy standing next to me kept telling me that you needn't worry if you get rid of the expectation, and as long as you don't get hurt, feeding yourself won't be a problem. The fellow sitting nearby, however, was nervous and said he would get an advance if he joined the big guild and could pay off his debt so he could live with his daughter again. He hoped he would at least get a promotion. I looked at him askew and realized that wounds do change a lot of people's lives after all. A hunter's strength is determined by his rank, no matter how much he practices with the ball or trains his body. It's not easy to make up for the difference in rank. Nor can you ignore the income difference. Even Mr. Song, who couldn't stand up to the warden because of that difference. I realized that I had been raiding for many years, but I had never been able to go beyond my rank. But now it would be different. Soon the guy who came in last came back. He had a horrible face and started saying he was Irang. The girl told him to go next, but suddenly she turned her attention to the guy who was sitting next to me and asked if he wasn't bad, because he didn't look good. But the man replied that wasn't the point. He was a little worried and said he didn't want to go first. Since I was next, I went up and went into the room where there was a big glowing ball in front of me. When the girl asked me for my full name, I introduced myself to her, saying that my name was Jin Woo. She saw on the monitor screen that I had already been ranked and asked me why I had come for a reassessment. I replied that I was, and she wondered why only ranks always come in for re-evaluation. She asked me to put my hands on the dark crystal and wait. As soon as I placed my hand, the crystal began to lose its light and turn black. The girl was looking at her monitor and didn't understand what was happening. She thought it was some kind of error and asked me to wait to try to reboot the system. Soon, however, nothing worked, and she started telling me that this had never happened before. She apologized and asked me to try again. But soon nothing worked, and she didn't understand what was going on with the machine. But suddenly a guy came into our room and asked the girl why she was alone. The girl replied that her partner had gone to the bathroom, because he always leaves his post during rush hour. He started to ask what the problem was, and the girl replied that there was some problem with the detector. But the truth is, this guy came here because he was curious about what the Yoon Run was making such a fuss about, and he decided to find out if there really was something here. And he realized that there couldn't be. After all, reawakening is not something commonplace, and that was 3 months ago. And then the whole association was in turmoil over the events that may have happened that time. The head of the monitoring department went to him personally, but found nothing. The girl showed that the system kept giving an error, but suddenly that guy went into shock at one point and started asking the girl if she had worked here long. She said about 6 months and didn't understand why he was asking and hoped she hadn't done something wrong. The guy wondered about 6 months, and the fact that after the Hunter incident about 2 years ago, this is the first time this has happened. No wonder the rookie doesn't know. That guy ordered the girl to get Mr. Chang here quickly. That guy started saying that the bathroom wasn't the most important thing right now and everyone should get Chang here quickly, but no one understood why the manager was so worried. They decided to ask him what was wrong. The manager began to answer that it wasn't a mistake, but an immeasurable power, which meant that their detector couldn't measure his magical power. They soon realized that this man standing in front of them was the 10th in South Korea and he had an S rank. At the same time on the street, the association hunters were asking another about Hwang Dong-soo, a hunter from the Elga scavenger hunt, and they wondered if it was true that he was not related to the recent Red Gate incident. The fellow from the Hunters Association replied that Hunter Hwang Dong-soo had not helped the White Tiger Guild, despite their suspicions. He assured that he himself had been at the scene of the incident, but he hadn't fully stayed there, so he didn't know all the details. To this the fellow replied that of course he would not say a word until he was sure of the information. He understood perfectly, but went on to say that he was more interested in that finding of the ant with the wings anyway. Then the other guy started saying that they only found a dead body. But if it is confirmed that these ants can fly to the mainland without dying, then the guild will be notified sooner so they can start cooperating. But suddenly one of the guys raised his head and started looking at the building, saying that the building was pretty noisy today. But the other guy heard nothing and was less receptive. There are probably some new hunters in there who made some noise because of their rank. They decided to go check it out. They were very curious as to what was out there. But the guy from the Hunters Association realized that his interlocutor sensed it, but because of the good impression he was making, he had almost forgotten what kind of man he was. They started telling me that it was impossible to measure my strength with their detector, and they had to get permission from their superiors to use a more accurate detector. They asked me if I could visit them again in 3 days, and I agreed. But as soon as I came out of that room, those guys who were near the entrance had horrified faces. Because some of them had definitely smelled what I had been told, that my powers were impossible to measure, and they realized that I was an S-rank guy, and word was getting to them. But they couldn't imagine being able to see the immeasurable with their own eyes. And those guys who were standing around extracting their guild's new hunters were nervous. Some of them thought they had some influence and wanted to lure me into their guild, but others immediately turned around and started walking away. After all, their guild didn't have enough money to negotiate with such high randoms. But suddenly they saw that a hunter from South Korea's best guild began to enter the building, and they couldn't understand why the man calling himself Absolute Weapon was here. I look at this guy and realize that this man is John, and they say that with his higher level magic he can easily destroy a building with just one spell. It's that hunter known as the Ultimate Weapon, and that's the reason I have the nickname. Those guys from the different guilds were looking at us and started speculating that maybe I had already joined the Hunters Guild, since the top hunters had already heard about him, and it wasn't surprising that the head of the hunters came to meet him in person. But the guy from the Hunters Association, looking at me, realized that I really was still an S-rank at the last meeting. The hunter, dubbed the Absolute Weapon, was adjusting his glasses and pondering the uproar caused by the immeasurable result. He realized that I, who was in front of him, was the 10th man in this country. But once he took a closer look at me, he realized that he didn't need a doctor, and without a doubt, I was definitely a rank S, and there was no need to wait 3 days. This hunter started introducing himself. His name is John In, and he represents the Hunters Guild. He started saying that it looked like I had just gotten my wounds and asked if I had a guild I would like to join. If not, could he take some time away from me to discuss the matter? However, I walked past him and said that I declined. And as soon as I passed him, everybody who was there couldn't believe their eyes that I had just turned down a hunter called Absolute Weapon, who was very influential in this country. But I was interested in another matter. I still had 3 days before one re-evaluation, and I had a lot of work to do. I need to get back to the Demon Castle faster and create a cure. But that hunter guy, Absolute Weapon, started asking Jinchul from the Hunters Association that he forgot to introduce himself. But he realized he was being too assertive. Also, as soon as he turned his head, he realized that I had disappeared without making a sound, and I must have been a great hunter of the killer class. But suddenly another S-ranked hunter broke into the building. He was too excited, because he understood that if I joined the hunters, not only would they have 3 S-rank hunters, but they would also be on par with the best guilds in the whole world. But these guys didn't understand what the head of the White Tiger was doing here. The hunter with the glasses understood that there was a huge distance between the White Tiger Guild buildings and the Hunters Association building, and looking at the way he was panting, you could tell he had run all the way here. It turns out that the head of the White Tiger knew about the guy and what was going to happen here. He finally realized that the incident that happened during the White Tiger Guild training with that mysterious assistant meant that he was son Jin Woo's hunter. The head of the White Tiger did not leave him alone, for he could not stop him. The hunter, whose name was Absolute Weapon, began to feel doubt after seeing his attitude. It was safe to say that he was not the kind of man who would be easy to get. The head of the White Tiger realized that he was too late, and he was also upset that of all people he had been caught off guard by this particular Agatha who had just left, and now things had become much more difficult for the White Tiger Guild. But by evening I was already back at the hospital, where my sick mother lay. I looked at her, and it seemed to me that she could wake up at any moment. The eternal dream, the dream from which it is impossible to wake, was a disease, an epidemic that broke out after the appearance of my brother. I knew I could save my mother, and all she had to do was wait a little longer. I started to walk out of the room and thought about how I needed to get stronger, and if I was so strong after the middle floors, I wouldn't be surprised after the top floor. As I go up, my level goes up, too, but still, I should have a chance. Suddenly I saw a guy from the Hunters Association, and he started asking me questions about what happened that day. I was the one who had defeated the monsters in the double den, and thanks to me he could see that he had been wrong earlier. But I looked at him and didn't understand why we were meeting again. But he went on to say that the main job of his oversight department was to work with people, not monsters, and in other words, they should identify and punish law-breaking hunters. After that I told him that if it was possible, I would like to stay away from the Department of Oversight. He replied that they don't exist, that's the only thing holding back hunters, but that's nothing to S rank. He also said that someone would like to meet with me and asked if I could spare him some time.